while we let her get set up, I just wanted to see if if anyone had an opportunity to look at the materials I posted for final projects, and if y'all had any brief feedback about that before rather than doing it at the end. Okay, well, I encourage everyone to take a look at those materials and let me know if they're helpful, because then I can change tack if they're not. And Joyal, do you want me to share a screen to you? Okay.
Yes. Hi, everybody.
So everyone, this is Joyal Mulheron. She is the founder and executive director of Evermore. And I have worked with Joyal in the past, but I met her at a meeting and where she gave a talk on this very topic, and I was just so taken with it that it changed my own trajectory a little bit. And so I hope that you guys enjoy as much as you can. This is not an enjoyable necessarily topic, but we will be diving into bereavement and how bereavement operates in the US. And so I am just trying to figure out how to send the share to you. And I'm wondering.
I think I might have it. I was doing this today with someone. Yes, I have it.
Okay.
So I think what I'll do, I think actually as I share my screen, let's see, here we go. Let's just do that. How would you guys like to manage questions? Do you want to do it as we go along? You want me to zoom through some slides and then do it at the end? What's the preference?
I think conversational tone is ideal.
Awesome. Right on. Okay. So, all right, I'm just trying to get my screen organized here with your boxes. So I fell into this topic a couple of years ago, and Robin may have already given an introduction. I have been an advisor to senior political, gubernatorial and the White House folks on public health issues. So I'll just say that I have a rather high threshold for what I think constitutes a public health problem. As lots of people, when you're in those roles, lots of people come in your doors and tell you whatever their issue is a major problem in the United States. As I said, I fell into this a few years ago. I started, frankly, with the implications of child death at any age on American families, looking at what the implications were for bereaved parents and bereaved siblings. About 8 months to a year ago, I really was getting a nudge, if you will, from the quote unquote field that I needed to look more broadly. Which I frankly felt like I was already boiling the ocean with this topic, with bereaved parents and siblings. That's an enormous population, and it's an invisible problem. As I've stepped back and taken a look at more of the data, I think this is a significant public health problem in the United States, and abroad, I'm sure. But right now, my, if you will, ocean is just the United States, and it's focused on bereavement. So I'm going to give you some context here. I was asked to put together some objectives, so I just wanted to cover this in the very beginning. I'm not going to read this to you, but as you move forward in your careers, I would encourage you to think of bereavement as a risk factor for health, social well-being, and economic solvency or stability. I hope that you walk away from this understanding how a death can cause really a lot of collateral damage for an individual and for families. And I hope that you will be able to understand too why bereavement care is an essential element to a comprehensive public health strategy. My understanding is you've been getting a lot of other contextual data points on housing and on poverty and so forth, and it's so wonderful that you're able to understand that, because as a practitioner, when you go and do your work, you'll have a much more holistic view of what your patients or what your community is facing on a daily basis. So before we get started, I just want to level set on some definitions. So I don't use the word grief often when I'm doing my work, not to say that grief doesn't belong here, but a lot of people use the word grief and it means a lot of things. And so, you know, even today in COVID, people will talk about they are grieving their daily routine. Um, I am very clear, particularly when I'm talking to lawmakers or when I'm asking the advocates to talk to lawmakers, we are talking about bereavement and the implications of bereavement. Grief just opens the door, if you will, to an entire mental health lexicon, which becomes so broad, it's almost mind-boggling from a political perspective. Again, having served as that advisor, I think the definitions and the words that we are using, particularly around this issue, are super important. Not only because they're very sensitive. So if you look here at the bottom of the slide, I don't use the word heal. I don't talk about the word resilience here. You know, if you're talking to a family whose child died in a mass gun violent event, they may submit to you, they will never heal from this. Maybe in 50 years, they may feel that. Many families do not necessarily. So I do not make any presumption that and there is a need to heal. Rather, I really talk about functional coping and adaptive processing. Resilience really has a very strong personal accountability component to it. I know it's very popular to be resilient. There's a lot of efforts around building resilience. But at the end of the day, when I've done this work, if I cannot sit in front of an inner city mom, which I have, and said, you know what, Judy, geez, if you only had more resilience, you would have felt better that your son was murdered. Because I can't do that, and understanding that Judy is dealing with poverty and housing problems and the police and all of these other issues, I don't look at it as resilience. I look at it as weathering. How many hits can one person take before they crumble? So, so as practitioners, as you think about your work, you know, to the extent that you think that this is a constructive use of vernacular, please feel free to use it. Let's see, I talk about this as a public health problem, and it's a public health problem because it touches nearly every person in America, and there are a lot of systems that interface with those families, and we'll talk about that briefly. So with that, I'm just going to keep moving, and I'll pause maybe in a minute for some questions. But as I said earlier, it's an invisible problem in the United States. And part of that I attribute to a lack of accounting. And that means that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they capture who dies or how they die. They don't capture who survives. And so, if you will, this has been an invisible population for a very long time. In fact, this is, you know, when it hit me, it was about, I would say, 6 or 7 years ago now. There were a series of high profile events, and I would wake up in the morning and the news would be going, and I would hear about Trayvon Martin and Hydea Pendleton and the hotshot firefighters and the Sandy Hook massacre and the Jasper tornado and the Washington mudslide. And that's when it really occurred to me, oh my gosh, there are all these people surviving these premature deaths of their loved ones with little support, little community or professional support. There is a significant investment in this nation in the prevention of health, as you well know, whether it's pharmaceuticals, you know, or other methods. There's a little investment, if you will, in the aftermath of a death and how to prevent health decline or poor social outcomes, if you will, in the aftermath of a death of a loved one. And we'll get into that in just a minute. You know, from a public health perspective, it's good that I've been in Washington for so long because this is a really tough issue to crack through on. Look, there's no awareness on this issue. There's no fluency. I mean, we're setting, if you will, the dictionary here, which is why I think the use of terms is so important. There is no national funder or Congress isn't, if you will, funding anything, you know, related to this issue per se. In fact, I'll talk about this in a little while around MCHB, Maternal and Child Health Program. We'll talk about that in just a minute. It's an incredibly complicated problem. I'm not talking about you have a disease and maybe we can find a drug to help you prevent the disease, or it's, you know, it's a massive societal problem, and it's a very difficult, it's very difficult to navigate an organized approach. So let me just give you some data points. The unexpected death of a loved one is the most common traumatic experience that Americans experience. It is also rated their worst life experience. If you were to look at the data, and these are, if you look at the second point here, bereaved parents, siblings, children, and spouses are all at risk of premature death as a result of their loss. If you look here, I've put the N, so the sample size of the data here. This data largely comes out of the Scandinavian countries. Again, because CDC isn't capturing it. This is going back to how I don't talk about a mental health issue. Premature death is a medical outcome. It is not a mental health issue. And so this is a way, if you will, for advocacy purposes and ways of talking about it to get folks' attention, to really have them focus, if you will, on this slice of the pie and why bereavement is so important. Now, I had asked you guys to just read through a few pages of my outside witness testimony prior to hopping on the phone. And what I did is there's just a paragraph that, actually I will ask maybe one of you can read it to the group since you all know one another. I just find this particular paragraph to be really important for maybe us to hear. So I'll pause for a minute and I'll let someone else chime in and just read this paragraph at the bottom of the slide. I know you guys aren't shy.
I can read it. Today, 10 million American children are bereaved, with 2 million having lost a parent and a projected 8 million having lost a sibling. These uniquely devastating losses alter the lifetime success of these youth. Nearly 90% of detained youth have experienced the death of a close loved one, and 25% subsequently join a gang. Research finds that bereaved children experience lower self-esteem, reduced resilience, lower grades, and more school failures, heightened risk of depression, suicide attempts, suicide, and premature death due to any cause, drug abuse, violent crime involvement, youth delinquency, and a greater number of and more severe psychiatric difficulties.
So since I wrote this, thank you. Since I wrote that paragraph, psychosis has now been added to this list. This, for me, from a policy standpoint, this really gets my attention. Not just from, all of the outcomes, but 90% of detained youth. That is striking to me. And it demonstrates how the death of a loved one can really alter the life course of an individual. One of the things that when I started doing this work, there was very little data. And then over time, an R01 grant, which for those of you who don't know, an R01 grant is a very prestigious federal grant, probably the most prestigious federal grant. And it means you get a whole big sum of money. And the National Institute of Aging, which is under NIH, that's the institute that would give out the R01 grants, gave Deborah Umbrinson at the University of Texas, Austin, an R01 grant to begin studying health inequity. These are just very high level statistics. These statistics to me are gobsmacking. I'll tell you, when it comes to the death of a child, Black Americans are more likely to experience the death of a child. I think it's twice by age 30, 2 times by age 30 compared to their white counterparts. 3 times by age 70, and almost more than 4 times more likely by age 80. The death of a child has some unique outcomes in comparison. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But if you think about one death event, and then the individuals who survive that one death event, they've all lost the same individual. They've had different relationships. There are different outcomes, if you will, for each of those individuals. And when you look at the sum total of the population, you are talking about an incredibly large population of the United States experiencing the death of a loved one. On this is just a quick look at parents and siblings. I've defined this, as an injurious event, if you will, an injury onto the family unit, onto the nuclear family unit, causing a lot of ramifications and household instability. We know, for example, bereaved parents experience more cardiac events, immune dysfunction, psychiatric hospitalization, depressive symptoms, substance abuse, decreased well-being. They have relationship dysfunction often between the parents. They feel less purpose in life. They then make less wages in the immediate, and they have less future income in the long term, as well as premature mortality. Siblings, obviously, when mom and dad are in crisis, particularly when they're young, they become at risk. There's a number of challenges with school attainment, maintaining well-being, social connections, more interactions with juvenile justice, and premature mortality. In fact, one of the data points around siblings with premature mortality comes from JAMA Pediatrics. And that study looked at 5 million children, 56,000 of which had lost a sibling during adolescence. In the 37-year follow-up, there was a 71% all-cause mortality risk with the death of a sibling during adolescence. That is just that should thunder strike you, I hope, like it did me.
So Joyal, I don't want to interrupt your flow, but I think this slide is so important. And so I want to just pause for a second and ask anyone if it's blowing their mind that bereavement is an injury that causes symptoms. I see Masa nodding. Does anybody else want to weigh in? No, okay, everybody's quiet. Okay, fine. Thank you, Joya.
I have a question, actually.
Yeah.
I feel like I might be kind of jumping the gun because I don't know that this might be talked about further on in the presentation, but just everything that has been going on kind of recently with what I guess kind of what our nation's kind of been talking about with all of the racial unrest that's been kind of going on in the light of George Floyd, and I mean all kinds of other past events, but kind of I guess like George Floyd kind of spearheaded the current movement. And I feel like does bereavement kind of extend beyond just nuclear family and kind of can also extend to like the greater community? Because
of course, yes, unequivocally. I mean, and I'll tell you sort of the tension here is what data is available versus versus what we can say. So, before I came to this issue, no one was synthesizing this data. And I was, reading all these different things, and I started putting all this together and going, excuse me, I'm like, holy shit, who's paying attention to this? Like, this is a huge problem. And then I'm like, well, who the hell am I to be able to change this whole system? And so, and I'll tell you about some of the work that I've been doing. This has been a labor of love. And I have a very strong conviction that our nation can do better. And I'll talk a little bit about what I'm doing. You are 100% right. The data I have is on immediate families. The data we need and the data that I think ultimately we can demonstrate is that this is a massive problem. There are lots of intervention points. A lot of people have said, Joyal, I just think people don't know how to talk about death. And I say, well, maybe true. We talk about a heck of a lot of other things that I think are difficult to talk about, but I think people don't know what to do. And so, first, people don't even realize this is an issue because all of this data is spread all over the world. No one's consolidating it. There's no, if you will, DC presence looking at this information. And so I feel like I've seen the house on fire, frankly, for a few years. And I am just getting to a point now where Congress is starting to go, holy smokes, where private philanthropy is starting to say, maybe this woman isn't bananas. The other thing that I'll also tell you, and Robin knows this, and I don't know if it was in my introduction or not, but I have buried a child. And it wasn't until that event, that I'll tell you, when I come into these conversations, a lot of it is, oh, poor mom, she buried a kid. Like, let's just all listen to her, and then we'll just kind of scoot her out the door. But we've been able, I think, it's not only from the community aspect, but when I'm talking to legislators and I'm talking to these offices, I'm saying, look, we know that bereaved spouses, parents, children, and siblings are all at risk of premature death. When you go back to your district, you're looking at overdoses, suicides, mass gun violence. Now you've got COVID. Where are you sending these people, and what are you doing? Because they don't have any sort of triage system, which is something I'll talk about in a minute. This is a massive problem. My hope is that over time, we'll be able to start getting some of that community level data. And frankly, what I think needs to happen, and part of my function, if you will, is to flood what I call the field, that's everybody outside of DC, basically, flood the field with cash. Because, you know, if I was LGBTQ and I lived in Tulsa and had breast cancer, I could probably find a local program to participate in. If I lost my kid in, I don't know, oh, here's something, I got a call, not too long ago, and they lost their child in a political uprising overseas. They only speak this specific language, and no one in their community has had this experience. But wouldn't it be amazing if there was an online community that this person could be triaged into? Anyhow, so completely 100% agree with you. Other thoughts? I don't want to hog the airtime. Okay. So the way I'm going to give you a couple of slides on how I'm starting to think about it. I'm not going to spend an enormous amount of time on it. There are a lot of ways in which people die. And I'll tell you, if you ever want to be more paranoid in your whole life, you should come work on this issue, because I'll tell you, I've just learned, oh my gosh, they died doing XYZ, and it had never even crossed my mind that could be a dangerous event. There are sort of really a couple of different punctuation points. I would say if you are given a diagnosis, and particularly since you're in healthcare, you might be interfacing with people who are given a diagnosis that is terminal. There's a lot of, if you will, here it's labeled as anticipatory death. There's a lot of buildup into obviously that moment in the aftermath. That is unique, and that is different than an unexpected death. And not to say that one is worse than the other. There are different systems that people interface with. There are different people that interface with. I have had, people tell me they've had great hospice experience, and people who've told me they've had really awful hospice experience. I've had people say they've had great experiences with first responders or police, and not great, responses. And so anyhow, you should look at this. I tend to look at this through time stamping, if you will. There's before the death happens, there's during the event, and then there is the aftermath. I often talk about this issue as there's a before and there's an after. Depending on who you talk to and their relationship, likely anyone who experiences these death events will have a before and an after period. So this is, there might be a period before my brother died, and then there's a period after my brother died, and my parents were totally different in between. Does that make sense? Okay.
Nora, would you mind muting yourself? Nora, would you mind muting yourself?
So let me give you sort of today's status quo. So grief therapists, there are a lot of really good ones out there. So I don't want you to walk away thinking that I'm telling you otherwise, but there is very loose criteria as to what qualifies as a quote unquote grief therapist. Right now, as a therapist can go to a website, an art therapist, a grief therapist, any kind of therapy, you go to a website and you check a box. And that box says that you'll take a patient who's experiencing grief. Now remember, grief can be you lost your job, your pet died, you got a divorce, like, and I will tell you, losing, you know, a child in war is different than, you know, a sibling and watching them die of cancer slowly. It's different than losing your spouse to a heart attack. These are different forms of death, and there are different implications, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So part of when you want this urge to just refer people to a grief therapist, I just suggest that you kind of pause for a moment and really, if you will, you know, if you're in the field where you might encounter a number of people, try to pull together a resource list of folks that you would want your mom to go see, or your brother or your sister. As far as a care system, there's no triage. So when there's a mass casualty event, for example, there's a scramble as to, now we got to train a bunch of people. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, for years, when a child goes missing and they go out into the community, they begin to train, they identify one therapist, usually through a filtering process, and then determine this one therapist can handle this missing child case or this exploited child case, and then they train the heck out of them. A professional response, you know, this, because the issue is of bereavement, if you will, is invisible. I'll give you two quick examples. So the CDC, when there is a sudden unexpected infant death, which is often a sleep-related, an unsafe sleep environment and death, the CDC's gold star standard that it encourages police forces and local public health departments to do is to have families within hours of the death event reenact the event with a fabric baby doll while the police are taking photographs of them. So let me just say, imagine your child you've woken up and they are dead. I'll give you a quick story from someone out of New York. The medical examiner couldn't get there for 7 to 8 hours. Infant is left on the kitchen table until they can come. Parents are separated because the parents are the first ones to be suspected that they are guilty, according to DOJ guidance on these types of deaths. They are separated. The police say, we want you to do a doll reenactment. The parents say, no, we decline. The police say, fine, we're going to confiscate now all your computers, all your cell phones. Subsequently, it is often protocol to launch a CPS investigation on these families concurrently, even if they don't believe there's foul play. In this particular case, it took 8 or 9 months for the ME to get the histologies back. In the interim, CPS had been investigating the family. The ME said there's no cause here. The child just died of natural causes. We don't know what happened. CPS says, well, I'm really sorry that your child died and that, you know, that the ME is wrapped up. That's great news. We can't stop our investigative process with you. And so we're going to continue to investigate you. In the interim, the mother's employer said, you know, golly gee, Betsy, you're just not happy anymore. It's time for you to move on. And she lost her job. So the standard verse in CDC's chapter on doll reenactments says on the cover, and I quote, that doll reenactments yield surprisingly positive benefits for families and death scene investigators, to which Robin helped me work on this work very extensively. There is no domestic or international literature that substantiates that there's any therapeutic benefit to a doll reenactment, but it is a myth that has just propagated, and it is just out there, and it is cited. Even when Rob and I were doing this work, there was an opinion piece in the American Academy of Pediatrics saying that doll reenactments, it was an opinion piece, so it wasn't AAP, but an opinion piece saying that doll reenactments were therapeutic. When you know, an individual has hanged themselves, 911 protocol is to immediately cut down the individual. Now, if, you know, I have sat before families, and it's often their children of all ages, and I would just encourage you to think that it doesn't matter how old your child is, it's the relationship. They're still your kiddo, even when they're much older. And that if the 911, you know, I had one mother telling me frantically, like she was carrying scissors, and she's a nurse, and she knew, like there was no question that he was dead. And the operator's telling her, and she had a breakdown and she couldn't do it. And so I'm just giving you, if you will, some context for what these families may be experiencing when they're having these death events. I'm just going to run through the rest of this slide and then I'll pause for a minute. So there are very few professional resources, particularly on this issue. For example, how to give death notification. That is for medical providers, that's for police, first responders, and so forth. You know, they're not, if you will, large coherent family programs out there. There's, you know, maybe a childhood bereavement center and they might cater to mom and dad, but maybe not. There are very few policy protections. So for example, the death of a child is not a covered benefit under FMLA. And so you can in fact be fired from your job afterwards. I will tell you, while our daughter was terminally ill, it was not after she died, but my employer did ask me to leave the position, which I think is not legal, but it is in fact the reality out there. When it comes to research, and part of the reason why this issue is not on folks' radar screen is the researchers are uncoordinated. There's no national agenda. So we're not answering our most pressing concerns or our largest priorities around bereavement. So let me pause there and have you ask any questions. I'm actually going to flip on the light as well so you can see me a little better. But please, I can hear you. No questions? Okay. This is a map.
I have a question.
Yes, of course.
Sorry. So why are employees firing their employers firing their employees? Is it because they seem to be less productive, and then they just fire them?
I can't speak for, obviously all of the employers. Productivity is certainly one issue, economic product, and even depending on who you're talking to, there's some data out there, there's some economic data. The strength of the economic data, I would say, is variable because, again, we don't have a coordinated research agenda, so we're not answering our most pressing questions. Going back just to, not that certainly there are productivity issues, but there are also then health issues, and there are other things that you have to tend to. So for example, if you've lost a loved one in a violent and criminal fashion, you will have to interface with the criminal justice system for a prolonged period of time after the death of your loved one. And so there might be a lot of reasons that you get called out of work. If you have a loved one who's experiencing a prolonged cancer experience, they've got to go to the hospital. They're missing a lot of days. And so, so it does take a toll. This is a tough issue for employers to manage, for sure.
I just want to throw out there also that in the wake of a death, families are often managing some symptoms that they maybe have not experienced before as part of the constellation of things that naturally happen to you when you lose a loved one, like depression and anxiety. And those things track very closely to how your loved one was lost. And everyone experiences everything differently. But your performance at work does shift when you start experiencing emotional symptoms, or I hate to say behavioral health symptoms like that. And so I think that that's also probably a big part of it.
And I took this slide out, I'll say, from a bereaved parent perspective, which I've interviewed hundreds, if not more than 1,000, from people of all walks of life. There are three predominant symptoms that I see with those individuals. The first and number one is guilt. I should have, if I only, it does not matter how the child died. You will hear some really fantastical scenarios on how they should have known whatever was about to happen was going to happen. The second is God and spirituality, gods and spirituality. I would say you have the atheist on one end and you have the very devout. That may be 5% of the entire population that really are either like, there is no God, and this, like this person just died, or, this was God's plan. this is a very small amount of people. I would say 95% of people have a massive crisis around, I'm a good person. I, did all these things and I give back, and what did I do? I mean, I had one mother tell me that she thought she had a stillbirth because she smoked cigarettes as a teenager and her mom told her not to use cuss words, and she did. And I mean, the calculus, if you will, on both the blame and on sort of the God piece, I can go into a lot of different stories there too, I won't, are pretty large. The third on the parent side is suicide ideation, particularly from the mothers. And that carries through for quite a long time. Again, again, there's not an enormous body of research. I find that this is more, the ideation is more, I need to keep parenting. I need to make sure my child's okay. And I'll tell you, when those mothers start talking about about suicide, there are a lot of people who are like, holy Toledo. In fact, I know in one case in a neighborhood that I've talked to some families in a hardship neighborhood outside of Washington, D.C., when the mother discovered that her adult son had died of a heroin overdose and she was on the street, she was just in crisis, and she said she wanted to die too. What I was told by other families was that the police handcuffed her, put her in the vehicle, and then transported her to a mental health institution. So by the time you're seeing these people and your practices, you just have to be cautious, or I guess cognizant, that, man, when they say that they've lost a loved one, this could mean a lot of different things, and they're interfacing with a lot of different systems, and it could be very traumatizing for folks. So I have only a few more slides left. I'll just zoom through this one. I had to try to think about, how do I think about this issue? So I created, this is just Joyal's family experience map. And there's largely 3 institutions that families will interface with when there's a death event. Some sort of medical institution, a law enforcement institution, or the Department of Defense. Everyone goes into a body processing facility to some regard. And then I think there's sort of 3 predominant categorical outcomes, or sort of things that families are coping with in the aftermath. There's systems. There's your employer, there's social media, there's your faith, there's going to the grocery store for, like for me, I went to the grocery store for 9 months and I was still getting diaper coupons. So maybe I had a really good day and I hadn't cried yet. And then I get to Target because I got to buy toothpaste, and like, there's the diaper coupon, and, and then the rest of my day sort of unfolds. There's logistics. In the beginning days, it's hard to know. Did I shower? Did I eat? Do you have surviving kids? Did I leave my kids at, like, where are my kids? I mean, what day is it? I mean, it's very, if you've been in a practice or had a moment where you've had like a deer in headlights, it's kind of a prolonged deer in headlights moment for these families. Doing yard work, for example, could be a Herculean effort for a while for these families. And then there's remembrance, really trying to integrate that person into their life. I will tell you, families who find ways to integrate their loved one in their life tend to fare better. And so just looking for a constellation of ways to acknowledge both their presence and their absence tends to be very helpful for folks. Obviously, there are people who will struggle with this type of life event. That is about 10% of the population. 90% of the population will be able to cope in some fashion, but they're going to be really, if you will, hurt. An analog that I use to this, which is going to sound kind of weird, is blight in plants. So you can have plants that you get 2 strains of plants that both have blight. One will produce fruit, and it will keep producing fruit even though it has blight. The other one will never produce fruit again. So if you think about that, there's 10% of the population who will not be able to produce fruit again or go back to work or whatever the arrangement is. and the 90% will struggle through, but they are still sick, if you will. They still have a sickness that they have sort of woven into their life and adaptively processed, if you will, sort of that event. This slide is just showing you that there are waves of distress. There are continual victimization, if not traumas, sometimes placed on families. So there's the death event itself. It's how you're told. It's who you interface with. Did the police handcuff you and medevac you to a mental health institution? Then there's the transaction potentially, or the lack of being able to afford the funeral. Then you might go back to work, and your work is like, what's wrong with you? Get off your butt. Your church may say, suicide's a sin, and your person is damned to hell now. Your child may not be attaining at school anymore. You might not be eating. Your social relationships, your friends don't know how to relate to you. So they're like, I can't talk to you. Or I would say there is sort of this sort of like notion that you might be contagious. A lot of families have talked about that because it's happened to them, that their friends kind of pull back because there is this sort of undercurrent of like, well, if it can happen to them, it could happen to me, and I really just need to sort of pull back. All of this stress, if you will, immense amount of stress and financial distress can turn into a chronic condition in a number of different ways. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there's no socio-ecological model in this field that has been developed. So one of the many things that I have found myself doing, which I am wholly unqualified to be doing, is creating what a social ecological model is. Yes, Robin's laughing, it's totally true. This is the kind
Qualified.
Oh, please. This is the type of approach. These are the types of systems that families interface with, or where there should be policies and procedures in place, acknowledging that bereavement is in fact a health event. And now what we're trying to do is stem or prevent health, social well-being, or economic decline of these individuals. So what am I doing now? Well, actually, let me just see how much time we have left. Okay, let me just try to do this in like the last 2 minutes so we can spend 15 minutes talking. I'm trying to create a social paradigm shift with, I just think it's bananas. This is not what I thought I would be doing with my life. And I think it's very ambitious and potentially Pollyanna. There are three things that I think our nation needs to be focused on. We need greater information and resources for the public on this issue. We need more professional tools, and we need more coordinated research and policy analysis. So one of the things that frankly I've just started talking about publicly but have been working on for months now is the creation of a national center for the advancement of bereavement care. You can think of this as like the American Cancer Society. You're not going to go to the American Cancer Society to get your cancer care, but you might call them for information. You might go to them as a physician and see that they have breast cancer screening guidelines. You might go to them to learn about the latest, cancer facts and figures and research synthesis. You might go to them to learn, what is the current state laws for colorectal cancer screening in Ohio, for example. A few examples of the things that we're just sort of beginning to deliver, and this is just very high level, not the focus of this conversation, but under the resource and programs, we've created a pretty extensive grief directory. It's going to need a lot of work, but I think that there are about 500 to 600 different organizations right now in our grief directory. We talk to families share their stories. I'll tell you, when you talk to legislators, they're not going to remember that, suicide among young kids is up 75%. They will remember the parents who sat before them and told them how their child died and what their experience was. We're about to come out with some bereavement leave recommendations for employers. That's out almost any day now. And in advocacy, research and policy advocacy, recently, earlier last few weeks, right before COVID was happening here in Washington, D.C., we attached a bereavement care provision to the fiscal year 21 U.S. budget. The budget is the only bill that Congress has to pass each year. And so we added a provision, a no-cost appropriations provision in it that would require federal agencies for the first time to begin reporting to Congress what they're doing to advance bereavement care, if anything. The other thing that we're just beginning to facilitate some comments on is the Maternal and Child Health Bureau block grant that comes out. They solicit public comment every 4 to 5 years. Bereavement is not currently part of MCHB's priorities, and we think it should be. And so we're beginning to activate our state-based networks, if you will, to begin calling and submitting comments to make that change. 2 more slides, I think. So what can you do as practitioners? I think you need to be aware and acknowledge when your patient happens to tell you that they've recently lost or they've lost a loved one, sort of pay special attention. This would be maybe akin to like they're telling you they have cancer. You really do need to focus. To talk to your patients about it to the extent that you feel comfortable. I would suggest that you take them seriously and you recognize that there are a lot of associated risks. Obviously, you don't want to scare the pants off them, but you do want to start assessing at what level of risk are they? You want to make referrals to good sources. Again, like if you're going to send your mom or your dad or your brother or sister somewhere, that's the level of quality resource you want to use. I would suggest, if you have the option of tracking death events in your medical records, just so that it's something that is just part of your calculus, it is going to be part of their lexicon and part of their life. To some degree, if you have the ability to create a personal protocol and how you respond to folks when they've lost a loved one, I would encourage you to think through that. I would be resistant to the notion that everyone needs therapy or support groups. In fact, most of the leading psychiatrists will tell you most people don't use this stuff. They don't need it. In fact, in a mass gun violent event, most of those families can't even conceivably see a therapist or go to a group for 6 to 9 months after the event. They are too, if you will, sort of in the moment and still too traumatized to be able to process any sort of group activity. I would just say, just like anybody else, to be very sincere and be very respectful. Don't make assumptions on their behalf. Let them guide you, and to just be a really good listener and to ask questions that you feel are appropriate. And it's okay to have few answers. At the end of the day, this is a shared human experience. I have sat down with people who I stayed with a mom who was incarcerated and who's on Medicaid, and I stayed in her house and we talked about it. I stayed for the weekend and learned lots of other things about her and her community. It happens to all of us from all walks of life, and it's not about wealth or geography or religion. It's just a common human experience. The last thing is, if you're interested at all in sort of following our work, you can follow us on social, although right now I'm managing the social and I should never be doing that. I am not a social media person in any regard. You can sign up for the newsletter. You can register on our website to advocate. You can share your own story. I'm sure many of you have your own stories. We are now beginning to organize state-based groups. And so if, you are interested in bringing Louisiana sort of, in a more organized sense where I can start shifting people towards, a general POC, a point of contact there, we're going to be working on Senate appropriations. We're going to be working on the maternal and child health stuff. And then we're going to be talking to Congress about the National Center. So that's it.
Thank you, Joyal. That was a fabulous presentation. I really enjoyed that. We'll go ahead and open the floor now. It looks like Arden has her hand up. So why don't you go ahead and start, Arden?
I was clapping to thank you.
You're so nice.
Oh, that's a clap.
Yeah.
I love that.
Oh, you are so sweet. I'll tell you, while doing this, I've had people, oh, thank you. Oh, you guys are awesome. I've had people tell me like, you're stupid and this isn't a problem and you need to like go get a real job. I mean, like people have been, yeah, you laugh, Robin. I've had some real days that I'm like, what the hell am I doing this for? Maybe I am nuts. So,
I'm only laughing because the go get a real job part, because this is like the definition of hard work. So,
well, you're nice. But thank you.
So I know we've all made some notes and clapped. And so now that, oh, hey, Kelsey. Now that we have gotten to this other presentation, I'm wondering if you guys have questions.
I actually do have
oh, great.
and I came in a little late. I was actually coming from, I'm studying counseling. And so I was coming from a death and dying class.
Perfect.
But just thinking about everything that you've shared, and like, I think this elective class that I'm taking really will be the only thing that I'm learning. And so I'm wondering if you have any recommendations of places to look for continued training in that, so that I can really appropriately help clients that are coming in for grief.
Yeah, so I would say, and this is just my 2 cents. So I will first say the right now the locus of education would be a group called the Association for Death and Educational Counseling. It's called ADEC. Well, I'll just be very frank with all of you. When I've gone to 2 ADEC conferences. There's 600 people, and I walk in and everybody looks like me. Everybody, but 6 people maybe. That is a massive problem. So I just encourage you that as you're learning all of this, to just know that we're at the beginning of this. When I was talking to the head of bereavement counseling for Memorial Sloan Kettering recently, and I was asking her, like, do you know how they do doll reenactment? She had no idea. And I'm sitting there thinking, you're the head of bereavement for Memorial Sloan Kettering. How the hell do you not know how police are conducting doll reenactments? So it's not a criticism. She's a damn good therapist, I will say. She's really the person one person you might want to send your family to. But just trust your gut as you're looking through this stuff. Listen to people's story, and don't be afraid to I would just say, as you're listening, to just sort of start filtering, like from your own experiences or from your other patients. Like, I just trust your instincts is probably the most I can tell you. I hope that at some point we will be able, as the National Center, to be providing really concrete education, so that it's not just focused on therapy. So for example, when you talk to therapists, I often say to them, what the hell happens the other 23 hours of the day? Like, that's where we're all really struggling, is the 23 hours. And so, so I wish I could give you something really solid. The best I can do for now is ADEC.
Yeah, I think that is helpful. And I totally hear you. I mean, counseling is a very white profession. And that's something that we talk about in our program a lot. I mean, it was started by old white guys and has continued to be like that. And so there's a need for something different. Okay. So thank you for that starting point, and to like look at it critically.
Yeah.
I have a question. What you talked about is mostly about premature death. And if so, what would be a definition or age that is considered premature death?
So yes, I did talk about premature death. There's not necessarily an age or definition. It is the untimely or unexpected death, I would say, is sort of the most general. It's that, Bob went to work and Bob had a heart attack and no one thought Bob was going to have a heart attack. That's unexpected. A terrorist attack, unexpected. I will tell you, and I'll just give you, I mean, I'm not trying to be overly graphic with some of this, but I just want to really sort of paint the picture. Talking to a parent of who watched he died slowly of brain cancer for 4 years. By the time the child got into hospice, the parents shared with me that the hospice providers did not feel comfortable administering IV pain medication to their son while he died of brain cancer at home. The parents talk about how incredibly and how much pain their 8-year-old child was in. And they question as to whether or not it was criminal that he was not given the appropriate pain medication that he deserved. And so even if it's unexpected, people often dismiss the anticipatory death. I can't even begin to tell you, when people start talking about anticipatory death experiences, I have had parents tell me within a 24-hour period, their child tripped. Within 24 hours later, they had holes in their head. They were removing their skull to alleviate the pressure. I mean, we are talking, so I also don't want anyone to walk away and also make the assumption that there's some difference between anticipatory or unexpected. People might tell you there is. I kind of say baloney. I don't believe that. And that's because, Kelsey, I'm trusting my gut here. And I've talked to a lot of people and I'm hearing what they're saying to me. And what they're saying to me is traumatic and stuff that I certainly don't want to be, see my kids go through.
The surveillance definition for this is that a death is expected if it's a medical event versus unexpected, which is the accident. And then there's that question of prematurity. Did you die of old age? Versus Bob was 47 and walked in and had a heart attack, Because what I don't want to do is I don't want some of the outcomes that are a direct result of bereavement to get lost in premature death, right? Like, we need to be able to still draw those direct lines. And so that's where the surveillance piece really comes in too. But I hate that definition too.
I had a question as well, if you were, I don't want to rush either.
No.
So like in your presentation, thank you, by the way, I really appreciated it. I kind of got to thinking about medicalization of like common human things that we go through, like the medicalization of birth and what that's done to people, and medicalization of death and how most people die in hospitals now. They don't die at home like they used to. And you kind of answered this already in some ways, but I'm kind of wondering what the future of bereavement care would look like. Would it become this kind of medicalization that we've seen before and that we're now critiquing? Where
I hope not.
Yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I sure,
Yeah.
I mean, what I hope is that, in a couple decades, you hear, someone that lost someone and you say, what kind of bereavement care did they get? Like, or, what was available? Or did their employer do this? Did their faith do this? Like, that everyone sees that they have a role to play in this. And so, like, did they get, I mean, not that you'd be asking about grocery coupons, but you can imagine after these events, and now you're deluged with like all of these reminders and having to exist. So, no, I really see this as, that's where I sort of frame it more as a public health. I do think there are some medical things that need to be done. There's some insurance reimbursement, and we have got to get therapists or folks reimbursed like quality, and we've got to drive education there. We've got to get, maybe the first responders to not let the infant lay on the table for 8 hours. I mean, come on, people. So my hope is that there's a lot of other things that we need to be doing. But I really appreciate you bringing that up, because that would not be, if you will, sort of the vision.
Okay.
That's a great question. I'm very flattered to have been here and to meet all of you, and good luck in all that you're studying and all that you're doing. It's I'm sure on a daily basis, it's a grind and it's a lot that you're managing, but it's very exciting, sort of the path you're on and what you're about to go do. And I'm just really delighted to have met you, and thank you for your time.
These are the rock stars of the next generation.
Did any of you get to watch the John Oliver piece? It's kind of bananas, right? Like, yeah, it's crazy. Anyway, it would be funny if it wasn't like really true.
Right. I felt bad for laughing sometimes, but I mean,
I did too. Yeah.
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 Anyway,
Did you guys have any big takeaways, like mind blow moments from the John Oliver one? Because I love that piece, and I'm wondering if any that really resonates. Some of that stuff really resonated with y'all.
It's funny because, sorry, Arden.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I don't. I can't see who's talking. But go ahead.
Sorry. It's funny because I've been watching CSI, the original CSI from Nevada, and I'm looking at it. I'm like, oh, that's so cool. You know, the coroner, and you know they can tell all these how everyone died and everything. And then I saw the video, and yeah, that's not how it happens. You know, so sucks. And it's like, oh, well.
No, and one of the big secondary traumas actually is a big result of that. I can't remember now if he covered this, but there's no, when a family member dies, this is particularly relevant when a child dies of any age, the autopsy is often just mailed out at some point. And then you go to check your mailbox one day and there's a gross anatomical description of your child in your mailbox.
which I will say may not even be labeled. It may say that this is like from the county department, and you don't know this. It's like, you know, from whatever county you live in or parish you live in, and you don't even realize what you're about to open is the autopsy.
And another one is birth certificates and death certificates. Often they won't be in sync, and so even though a child died in the hospital, the family will still get a birth certificate in the mail at some point, you know. And so these are all like bizarre administrative quirks of our system that can be easily rectified, but actually cause tremendous injury to the people who experience them.
Yeah, can I share a few things there? I don't want to take your time. One, I've had every I've ever spoken to tell me that they've lost fetal remains, not intentionally, but then their families that go home empty-handed. And part of that is because hospital protocol, they don't spend enough cash, if you will, on sort of morgue procedures. And so people are like, that might be part of the kidney too. And so they discard it. Also, you know, from a medical examiner versus a coroner, just to be clear, the quality is not a function of title. Like, we would probably want to think, oh, a medical examiner has more experience, and so they would be higher quality, but that's not necessarily the case. You know, in one case, I had a family whose daughter had died, and the family was at the ME's office. The adult child was taken by ambulance to the ME's office. The ME said, this is a drug overdose, you know, whatever. Her mom and her sister, the deceased sister, who was an Army paramedic, came in and was like, there's too much blood. This is not a drug overdose. Like, no way. And she began looking at the body. She pulled the head back, and it was an execution by gunshot. It was a gunshot in the back of the head, and it was an execution. So I can give you countless examples of where criminal proceedings did not proceed because there was a screw up with the ME or the coroner. I will not regale you with these things, but no wonder people can't cope. My God, you know, like, and we're expected to go back to work and be these happy individuals. Well, you know, the whole family is often reeling. And so it is, you know, you can't obviously solve it all in your practice, but just knowing that this is an issue and understanding that there is, if someone is to tell you, my husband just died, man, you don't know what can of worms are there, but to acknowledge there's going to be a can of worms, no matter who they lost or how they lost them. The fact that they would even be divulging that to you is probably a cry for help in some regard, or a cry for solidarity. So anyhow.
I wanted to talk a little bit about, I feel like COVID deaths are some of the worst because nobody gets to be with family when they're dying. And I think I've watched some of the videos of people who work at hospitals and who are coping with bodies and trying to get them into the hands of funeral. funeral homes. But in New Orleans, I know that there was a huge holdup. The cemeteries were ready to accept additional bodies. The funeral homes were ready to accept more bodies, but the hospitals were having a really hard time getting anybody to do the death certificates on folks. And also they have a highly reduced capacity for their morgues here. And I don't know if that's like a procedurally like something new. I remember when I was like very little being in the morgue at the hospital that my parents worked at, and it was huge. It was a huge morgue, and apparently the morgues at the hospitals here are tiny. Like they hold maybe 4 bodies, not like 30 or 100. And I wasn't sure if that was like part of the hospitals for profit, right? Like every piece of the hospital is real estate, and so they keep the morgue really small, or what. But I was wondering if you could kind of speak to that dynamic at all.
So I can't fully tell, that's a great question. I can't fully answer it. And I'll say a few things that sort of sparked for me. So first I'll tell you unequivocally, I think all of you should listen to this statement. If you walk away with nothing else, walk away and know that whoever your administration is in whatever field you are working on, you are not going to have the proper benefits or personal care that's going to be provided by your employer. So you're going to be interfacing with people with a lot of hardship, and what you need to do for yourself, particularly if you are working with people who are dying all the time, you have to set very strong guardrails to keep yourself well and to keep your well-being. And so one of the things that I have done is I don't watch television. I hear enough. I can't watch it. And so I will be quite honest with you. I watch the John Oliver piece because someone sends it to me. And I watch college football, and that's it. And so I couldn't watch the CSI. I can't do it. I can't watch Law and Order. I can't do it. I have not watched a lot of the COVID. I will say just briefly on sort of the Emmys and morgues and so forth, and back to the John Oliver. I mean, we have to, as a society, say that it's worth the funding in order to have these more procedures in place, in order to say that they deserve real estate, in order to acknowledge that, maintaining these very small spaces or these lack of procedures just is inadequate. I also just want to make one other note. Yes, the pandemic, there are very unique circumstances. I also just want to be clear that imagine you have, lost your brother, your sister, your child in war. In some ways, yes, they've signed up for it. They didn't get to be there. They don't get to hold their hand. They don't get to, if you will, to be present. I'll give you a healthcare story just briefly from a mother whose 30-year-old son died in a kayaking accident. He's on a ventilator. He's in the hospital. The hospital calls from 3,000 miles away and says that her son is dying, and she's distraught. And in retrospect, the healthcare provider never said, "Can we FaceTime? Can I hold the phone to your son's ear so that you can say goodbye?" So I also just don't want to make yes, the pandemic is unique for a lot of different reasons, and I don't want to diminish that. But I also want to acknowledge that there are a lot of other people who have lost their loved ones and they were not able to be there. In some cases, they're not able to be at the burials. Imagine, for example, immigrant families. And, for me, knowing the mother who is a janitor, whose son has been killed by a drug cartel back home, she can't legally or financially afford to leave. She's not going to get to say goodbye, and she better show up to work tomorrow. She's not going to be able to feed herself or her family. And so, again, I don't want to diminish and say that this isn't unique. I just want to acknowledge that there is actually a large group of people who also have had these experiences. We've just never acknowledged that as a society.
All excellent points. Nora, I have one thought for you on the death certifiers. I am wondering if that is because people just weren't back at work yet, because generally the death certification process is done by someone at the funeral home. So I think that probably was more of the holdup than anything, weirdly. And then I think another thing, I know I've seen in the past that New Orleans really struggles with major death events and just having enough space. I remember during Katrina, we brought in extra cold storage. Like we had cold storage trailers for the bodies. So I don't know why. It doesn't make any sense. That's a really good question. Maybe that's your project. Anybody have other questions for Joyal?
I have one. Now that COVID is kind of bringing to light this new death without being with your family members and things like that, do you think that in Washington, D.C., policymakers are going to start to look at death a little bit more now?
Yeah, I've caught people's attention, I think, big time. In fact, the fact that I started walking into offices in mid-January about bereavement care. They've never had a meeting on bereavement care. No one's ever talked to them about this before. Hospice comes in, but hospice helps you die, if you will. They don't help you get your life back together. And so the fact that, frankly, I was able to walk in, talk to the offices about this, I give them, the few stats that I've given you. I talk about, they go back to their districts. There's overdoses and suicides and mass casualties and all this, and they're all shaking their head and like they immediately get it. The fact that within 6 weeks we were able to attach an amendment on the U.S. budget is like a BFD. Like it's a huge BFD. I don't know how else to, and the fact that like this woman is doing it largely from her kitchen table and activating people, right? Like there were all of these things happening in this moment. I will even tell you that in some meetings, because I've done White House and I've done governors, I haven't done Capitol Hill. It's its own enchilada. The House is very different than the Senate. I'm not an expert on sort of all the mechanics. There are people who their whole career is just the mechanics of these places. And so I would be in meetings and, the chair of health appropriations on the House was like, Joyal, you need to do a member letter. Like that's the next step here. And I was like, that's a great idea. How do I do that again? Like, I don't have any fluency in this. Like, tell me how to do a member letter. And then they were like, this is what you need to do. And so I was like, got it. And then I went out and I, was able, and there's a lot of things I had to do. And at one point it was literally the Hail Mary pass. Someone called me the Doug Flutie of bereavement, which I didn't know what that meant, but apparently it's like it was like the last second of this major, I think, college football game in the 70s. And he threw this huge Hail Mary pass and they made a touchdown. And so anyways, and that's what it was. But the fact that we were able to meet with these offices and then get it attached in 6 weeks is really shocking. The fact now that I'm talking to some of these offices about a national center with a large appropriation attached to it, I think we're beginning to capture the imagination of some of these lawmakers and say, holy smokes, this is actually an issue that we should have for the country in a way to help families, in a way that we respond, not just to families, but also to the professional workforces.
Any final thoughts?
Well, you have my email, so you can always email me. I may, if I can't get back to you right away, just know that my pants are probably on fire. I will get to your email, I promise. But I do try to be super responsive. Anyways, I just appreciate being here and the invitation. Thank you. And good luck to all of you.
Thank you. Everyone unmute yourself so we can give everybody a good round of applause. Yay! Thank you, Joyal.
All right, bye guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
I wanted to chime in really quickly about the pharmacist discussion group.
Yeah.
I guess, are we going to do it? And also I realized I know one of the producers and I wasn't sure. It sounded like what we had talked about was having just like a discussion group with just us, but should I ask the producer if he would want to talk to us about it?
I mean, I don't see why not. That sounds like really cool. What a tremendous idea. I would love to do the farm. I just been knocked off because I was sick for so long. So like my rhythm of getting things done is just way behind, but I would still really love to do that. And
yeah, it's so cool that it ties in very much to bereavement.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
So like, do you guys want to just go ahead and say like, we can like doodle poll a time for maybe next week? Because basically everyone who's staying on is like, who wants to do it? And so do y'all want to just like, well, maybe not this coming week, but the following week, do y'all think that maybe you would want to get started on that? And just, and like what form do you think do we, cause like if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I've watched it now. There are 4 sections, is that right? Mm-hmm. And so like, do we want to watch all of them and then meet with the producer and like have a discussion group, or do we want to do a discussion group and then over each of the individual ones and then have like a final discussion? Like what makes most sense for you guys' time and energy level right now? Nora, what were you thinking would be a good way to weave this person in? I mean, not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I don't know. I had not imagined that we were going to do 4, but I do understand why we would do 4.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like if we're incorporating the producer, it'd probably be good to have like one large discussion about all of them together.
All of them together.
Just to be considerate of their time.
Well, I think, oh, sure. But I think the reason why I was moving more towards having 4 was because there's just so much in each episode.
There is, yeah.
I feel like if we try to do 1 hour and a half, even if it were an hour and a half discussion group, we would never even get past the first episode anyway. Like there's just so much in each one. And so I think that's why I went that direction personally. But I'm flexible. I'm just offering to provide a platform and to talk with you guys about it. But if there's a different format that works better for y'all, I am fine with that.
Well, what if we did like, we watch an episode and we have a discussion for the 4, and then maybe on the last one, the producer could come in and we could maybe just tie it all together. That way, you know, we've seen them all, and this way we can still kind of break it up so it's not too much.
I think I second that. I think it would be a lot better for us to have our discussions amongst ourselves and then hear from the producer. I think that would be really
cool. I love it. Yeah. Okay.
Maybe we could like come up with questions that we have as we go through our discussions and then like have a Q&A with the producer at the end.
Yeah.
I really love that. I really love that. Okay. I'm just making a note, and I'll probably send you guys an email sometime in the next few days to actually get it started. So I appreciate everyone, of course, being patient with me as I try to get like back to where we were. So we're saying 4 total sessions, and then the final one, we would include the producer. Okay, great. Love that.
And then I wanted to mention that I did look at the documents for the final project.
Oh, yeah.
And I really appreciated having all the deadlines like in a list. That was awesome. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I figured. I was thinking about what would help me if I were in your position, and I was like, I'd be so annoyed that I didn't have a list of deadlines. So yeah, I think that's really good. And I also am hoping to give you guys like more structure around each of those, which is helpful, you know, like we all know what's coming, you know, so 3 and then 1. Okay, cool. All right. Anything else, guys? Okay. Well, I hope everyone has a nice dinner and an evening, and I'll talk to everyone soon. Miss y'all.
I miss you.
Bye.
Bye.